a land-grant university, we would like to acknowledge that Utah State University campuses and centers reside and operate on the territories of the 8 tribes of Utah. The Logan campus is situated on the Sahivagoy or Willow Valley, the ancestral lands of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, where the Shoshone people have stewarded the land since time immemorial and continue to live today. We acknowledge that these lands carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. We affirm Indigenous self-governance history, experiences, and the resiliency of Native peoples who are still here today. So first, we're going to hear from our speaker, and then we'll have a brief Q&A, and that will be followed by a social with refreshments upstairs in the common studio. If you need credit for being here, the Slido will open after the Q&A. Please enter the code found on the wall, then your name, your A number, and each course separated by commas. Here's an example if you need to know what that looks like. If you have questions about that, you can ask Deandra after the talk. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Van Clark, to introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Okay, today is a super special lecture as it's our first speaker series sponsored by USU's student chapter of the American Planning Association. As such, we've got an amazing guest lined up for today, Justin Romeo. Justin was born and raised in Chicago and ran track in his high school. He went on to pursue multiple degrees and now lives in New York City with his wife and 2-year-old. Justin has a Master's of Science in Urban Planning from Columbia University, as well as a Bachelor's in Civil Engineering from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor's of Mathematics from Morehouse College. Justin is a professional engineer and planner and worked for Chicago in the Illinois Department of Transportation for 7 years before moving to work for New York City's Department of Transportation, where he now serves as the Director of Special Projects in Regional and Strategic Planning. As such, Justin is a member of the American Planning Association and served as Regional 1 representative to the Student Representative Council from 2018 to 2020. He also served on the American Planning Association's awards jury in 2020 and 2022 to help select the winners of the National Planning Excellence Awards. These awards span master plans and comprehensive park and green space plans, transportation and school initiatives, to action plans for cities, counties, and states in response to mitigate and adapt for climate change. He advocates for and upholds the causes tantamount to the discipline of arts and culture, civil rights and social action, science and technology, and the community and social ties that bring us in this work together. We are so grateful to have Justin visiting Utah for the first time to come speak with us. Without further ado, Justin Romeo.
Hello, everyone. All right, thank you, Van, for that wonderful introduction. I'm pleased to hear such things about myself and excited to be here with you all today. I want to say first thank you very much to the university, to the Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning Department, to the APA chapter, and especially to Daniela and Van for inviting me here to speak. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you today a little bit about my work in New York City and the possible overlaps with the work that you all are and the study that you all are doing here. I will quickly. So, as the title of the talk really is focusing on reimagining the streets, and this is a chance for me to really dig into some of the trends that I am seeing in the current transportation planning landscape and how we are really thinking about planning for our cities and for our transportation space in a different way than we historically have. I'm going to do a little bit of diving into the history and of transportation and how it connects and some of the justification and reasons for why things are the way that they are now. And then start to talk about a few projects that I've put forth that I believe speak to the advances that are happening, and then kind of close out with what I think is on the horizon and coming next. I will say, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I know this is being recorded as well, though, so happy to answer questions at the Q&A later and at the reception as we're following this session. All right, so as Van said, I'm Director of Special Projects at the New York City Department of Transportation. I am an urban planner and a civil engineer. I started out in civil engineering first. That was my first degree, and then moved to urban planning after working for a number of years in Illinois. And I think for me, I think both professions are very important. I like to put them down because I'm proud to be both an engineer and also an urban planner. I think they both bring perspectives to the work of like planning and designing our cities, an important perspective to the work of planning and designing our cities. I will say that I think that civil engineering is often very focused on the best way to do work, the best way to design, the best way to put streets out there, but not really as focused on understanding like, well, why are we doing the things that we're doing? And so what I think urban planning brings to the land and is also environmental planning, and really like a lot of the disciplines, is just to focus on expanding the questions as to why we're doing the things that we're doing. And I think both of those things are equally as important and needed for the work that we do in terms of planning our built environment. I will say I think the other important part of like leaning on the urban planning and the civil engineering is that once you get out of the kind of halls of schools, like you are put into the workplace where you're going to be working very closely with planners, engineers, architects, and many other professions as we do the work that we need to do. And so it is very important to think about like working across lines, even starting as early as possible in school, because that will be like very much a part of like what you do in your work world. So the New York City Department of Transportation is sort of primarily responsible for managing the streets of New York City. And this is the mission of the organization. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will say, like, when I came upon it after joining, I actually looked at it like first after I joined the department, and I thought it was like it was very comprehensive and like encapsulating what I thought was the important elements of the job of the department and thinking about transportation more generally. And then I think two pieces of it like really stood out for me. So this focus on environmental responsibility, and then also a focus on sort of quality of life of our primary customers, city residents. So I think like the first stuff, safety and efficiency, are things that are paramount and like very important, but they are kind of not non-negotiable questions. It's like safety, we want to get to a place where there's no crashes and no injuries. Efficiency, while like we could grapple a bit with like what it means to be most efficient, like generally it's like the fastest and like sort of easiest way to get through something. But like environmental responsibility is something that I think has continued to change and to develop, like as we are learning more about the consequences of our actions and about like what the effects of our environment or our actions and the built environment that we've designed are on the larger like environmental system. So it puts us in a place of needing to be like requiring in the mission to be dynamic and to be thinking about what are the priorities of the people of New York, and then kind of get back to the bottom there, and what are the priorities of us as a city, and ensuring that we're focusing on those things in our planning work. And then this quality of life of our primary customer, city residents, also really drives us to be, I think, thinking and reimagining really like what it means for us to be a transportation agency. So back in the 1950s, like what transportation was and what it fulfilled for people was one thing. And now I think that's another thing when we think now about our streets, especially in response to kind of like how people have been adapting and like changing as a response to COVID. And so I really like these parts of the mission because it allows us to say we are going to be thinking about things differently. And that's like some of the work that I think we've been doing over the past like 20 years or so. So just to give a little bit of context, we do not do the work of like planning transportation in New York City on our own. Like it takes a team. It's a big place. It's very complex and dynamic. So I just want to talk about some of our partners and also really like lean into the fact that like these are organizations and people in these organizations that we have to work with very often. Many of them are engineers. Many of them are planners. Many of them are architects. Many of them are designers in different varieties. The MTA runs our transit service. They run our buses, our trains, our commuter rails in the area. The New York State Department of Transportation is our sister agency at the state level. Largely, they focus on the highways and also focus on our interaction in relation with the US DOT. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is a somewhat unique organization to New York. And New York City, it controls like the airports in the region, but also more importantly for like our day-to-day transportation, they control the major crossings between New York and New Jersey, and like ensure that they are being maintained and that there's like representation and sort of power held equally in both by New York and New Jersey, and sort of maintaining those crossings and the value that they provide to sort of the regional transportation in the area. And then the last department I'm going to list is the New York City Department of City Planning. And this is, we work with many departments within the city government, many agencies within the New York City government, but in particular, we work really closely with the Department of City Planning because there is clearly like a strong link between the land use and the transportation systems that we manage and control. So it is very important for us to ensure that we're thinking about those things in lockstep. In particular, like there's a transportation department or kind of unit within the New York City Department of City Planning that we work very closely with as the planning department inside of New York City Department of Transportation. So I want to go and provide a little bit of history, and I'm simplifying it for the like factor of our talks, but I wanted to like touch on a few points that I think have sort of driven us to the like path of the built environment that we have now, and like why I think we need to be in the space of like reimagining and why we are in that space. So I think starting off early, and again, like giving you some agency for taking a little bit of liberties here, but we, largely our built environment was focused around waterways. So we think like cities were built on major waterway connections. That is a way that we were able to move many goods and like many people before the advent of many other transportation modes. Then like trains started to be developed and started to open up the frontier and allow us to move into new areas. And that became like an organizational principle, I think, for our built environment and for cities. And you see that that's what many cities that operate, biggest cities now, are at the nexus of train connections, and because that's the way we're like able to move goods. And then really the national like highway system and the interstate system is really like a large organizing tool for our environments now. And as we've like made this progression, I have like this chart here, and I'll walk through it a little bit, but I think it talks through like how we've also changed the way in which we travel, and like how I think we've gotten to a place that is not a sustainable way forward. And so I think a lot of our work has been to say, okay, well, now that we are in this place, how can we start to transition and move into a more sustainable way? And so this chart really looks at the sort of number of trips that were taken by transit, starting in the early like 1900s through 2019, with sort of clear peak happening. That little bump in the middle there is around like World War II, where there was a like strong like pullback in many of the like fuel regulations, and so like as a country we like pulled together and started focusing more on riding transit in order to provide and ensure we have materials for supporting a war. But after that, they really have tailed off, and like transit trips have remained at sort of a constant number. What's missing from this chart is the car trips, and the black line really details the percentage of sort of overall trips that transit makes. So it's been a drop off from near 100% to like less than 5% now. And while I think that car travel and the highway system has opened up a lot of opportunities, I think it also has limited us in many ways, and I think we are dealing with the effects of that from an environmental standpoint now. This is a map of the highway system, which has been central to the expansion and sort of the management of movement across the country. This was sort of started in the 1950s as a goal of like making the country more navigable for military, but also for individuals, but has also become a sort of primary focus of transportation and of development and of sprawl in many cities and many parts of the country. And so this, I think, is something that we have to start to think about, like, and it permeates not only at the national level, but into like our local level of travel as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit as well about sort of the history of like how we make decisions about transportation systems now. And it is largely like influenced by the National Environmental Policy Act that was passed in 1970 and the environmental review process. And the goal of this process really is that system that was built in the 1950s through, I think they ended maybe in the 1980s, was a system that did a lot of damage to a lot of communities and a lot of cities, and was not like really responsive. There was not a chance for people to really provide input on like how this like roadway system was going to affect like their neighborhoods. It would push through many places that just did not have the political agency nor the political power to fight them. And has sort of left a number of scars in like cities that exist. And so part of this was saying we need to have a system that does not allow that to happen anymore. But sort of central to this process, even though it is, had this like very positive goal in the beginning, we have somewhat started to reinforce the very things that were put in place, that this was put in place to like protect, especially around transportation planning, because oftentimes the thing that this is most often used to combat is congestion. And it is a very understandable goal. Like, congestion causes poor air quality, it causes poor quality of life. People do not want to sit in large amounts of traffic if they do not have to. And also like idling cars, like if it takes longer for cars to get placed, those cars release like somewhat very dangerous chemicals to the environment and to the health of individuals. So wanting to ensure that the changes and things that we are doing to the environment, to the transportation system, do not exacerbate this concern is a very good goal. But I think the issue has come into play is that there's such a thing, and the term we call in the transportation planning world, of like induced demand. And that I think the solution often put forth for congestion conditions is to widen the roadway, to create like more space. But we have found it is not sufficient to create more space, because eventually if you create more space and the roadway is more pleasant to drive upon, and more people will start taking this route who were taking other routes because this is a straighter, more efficient route, and it will become more congested. And more people eventually will move to the communities that are connected to this route because it is an easier way for them to get to the places they want to go, and it will become more congested. And so we've seen that happen over and over again, where some of the biggest highways that exist in the country are some of the most congested highways that exist in the country. So it's like the solution here is not always to create more space for the more cars, but then oftentimes environmental review will slow down a process that says, well, if you want to take a lane away from one of these to do something that is supportive of mass transit or supportive of biking or supportive of more pedestrian space, it is limited because like a lot of the analysis and a lot of the work that goes in transportation planning is focused on congestion reduction, and reducing a lane on an already congested roadway clearly will make it more congested. But so this is why I think we have to be thinking about our streets and our transportation system in a different way. And I pulled this photo. This is from New York, and this is from about 1956, I believe. And I'm sorry, 1856, excuse me. Yeah, a little bit while ago. But it shows, like, I think this is not new, what I think we're trying to do with the streets in New York. Having like an active, busy place where pedestrians and cars and like transit vehicles interact in like a safe and like efficient manner is not something that we haven't done before. It's just something that we've gotten away from. And so it's really like moving us back towards that goal. And this is a picture that I actually took outside of my house and not down the street from my house. It's 2nd Avenue, which is a major thoroughfare in New York City. It gets shut down. Every summer there's a festival that happens, and they close it for the day. And I think this is what we're working towards. So working towards a place where the streets are not just a place for transportation, but they're a place for people to really come and enjoy the space that is available to them. And also, not to cut out transportation, but to think about the streets as more than just like thoroughfares that should be treated as the most efficient way for people to get through their zones. And so the work in New York City really started in the early 2000s after the 9/11 attack. There was, under Mayor Bloomberg and the Transportation Commissioner at the time, her name was Jeanette Sadi Khan, they went about trying to think about where in the city is it valuable or possible for us to think about the space differently. And one of the first places that they landed on was Times Square. And this is something that I feel like most people probably are familiar with. Big lights, Broadway, very attractive space. And when it was operating beforehand, there were major streets cutting through it, but also still a ton of professional people and pedestrians walking along the street. And we have many places like this in New York City where I think the pedestrian or bicycle traffic greatly outnumber actually the number of cars that are able to get through on the roadway. And so it was their vision to say, let's establish this spot in the middle of Manhattan, one of the busiest places in the country. Let's establish this as just a pedestrian-only zone. So we're going to take one of the major streets and we're going to cut it off and we're going to turn it into a pedestrian plaza. Back to the environmental review process. Typically, changes like this take a really long time to get approved. They have to go through state review and federal review to ensure, again, these negative consequences are not going to be happening for the surrounding communities. What they did was they created a temporary condition, and this is something that we've actually popularized in much of the work we do. It's we're not going to close this permanently. We're going to create a temporary closure here, put up some barrels, and we've gotten to the point where we do it a little bit better with paint and with bollards, but it's something that could be removed if it's decided that it's overly harmful. And they said, we're going to close it, and then we're going to see how things are. And they closed it, and there was a lot of fanfare, there was a lot of frustration, and a lot of doom and gloom, but ultimately, it was okay. And so it has been hardened today, and we've done the proper environmental review process. It helps showing that we did close it, and it did not have these negative impacts on traffic around it. And now it's a plaza in a space that is still very crowded, but is much more pedestrian friendly, is much more a destination and a place to be in a much more comfortable place than it used to be in the past. The other ways in which I think we are, as a city, have been really working on this is the expansion of our bike lane network. So this is showing a picture of the network from 2000 to 2018, and just how it has grown and expanded into many parts of the city. There are many still places where we want to increase connections, and we're continuing to work on that through a number of plans. But the work has been going on. This is before I started. So I started the department in 2018. The work was going on before I started there, but has really been kicked into, I think, a higher gear by the support after COVID and just our sort of response to that. So today I want to walk through 3 projects that I've worked on that I feel are sort of representative of some of the reimagining work and the ways in which we have been thinking about the streets and thinking about planning for the streets in a different way. The first is the release of the New York City Streets Plan, which was a comprehensive plan really to say, how do we want to explore and utilize our streets for the citizens of New York. not just the maintenance, but we're thinking about the planning and the future of them. The second is sort of a report and like study on understanding the economic benefits of sustainable streets. So how do we quantify the benefits that businesses and localities and people get from the projects that we're doing on the streets? And then the last is a study that we have not completed yet. We're like halfway through, but it taps into a larger trend across the nation that's happening about sort of looking at the national like highway system and really saying like, how can we start to like pull back some of the harm that has happened because of the building of this system? And so we're doing a project to reimagine the Cross Bronx, which is an expressway that I will show that cuts through, really cut through the Bronx, which is a borough in Manhattan. Borough in New York City. So the New York City Streets Plan. It was a legislatively mandated plan that passed in 2019, right before COVID, and it mandated that we, the Department of Transportation, create a 5-year comprehensive plan to say how we would improve the streets for multimodal and increased like safety activity. It had a lot of benchmarks that we needed to reach in terms of outputs that we as a department needed to have done in those 5 years. So thinking about the number of bike lanes or the miles of bike lanes or the miles of bus lanes or the number of plaza, the amount of plaza space that we make available. And then it required us to do annual updates to the report to talk about how we're doing on those goals. And then lastly, it required us to ensure we were talking to the public about this work and explaining to them just what we were doing and why we were doing it. In our sort of internal like working, so we got this mandate from our legislator and we said, okay, well, how can we make this process one that is like not only meeting the like letter of the law, but really helping us to fulfill some of our larger goals? And like the first thing that I think we wanted to focus on was the fact that outputs and like how much work we do is important, but ultimately we're really most interested in outcomes. So like how does this influence the life for the people who live in New York? So a lot of what we were saying is like we can talk about the outputs, but we also want to ensure we elevate like what are the outcomes? So are people like improving ridership on the transit service? Do people feel like through surveys like a connection and like openness like to the streets? Like do we have measures that go beyond just like the work that we do and ensure that that work is like landing and hitting and being impactful and effective for the people of New York? And then also we wanted to say, okay, is this an opportunity for us to organize some more things that we were thinking about at the departmental level? So since we had this big mandate and we're going to pull everyone around the table and sit down and do it, so what are some other things that we want to make sure we can get agreement on and get centered around? So one of the like central things was the development of an equity framework for the department as a whole. And so there are many frameworks for equity at the federal level, at the state level, at many different portions, but we, at least as the Department of Transportation, didn't want to have every single unit and group kind of coming up and defining like what it meant to be equitable from their own like perspective. And so we wanted to lay some groundwork to say, look, this will be our like base equity framework. If you want to do some things on top of that, you can, but let's have a shared understanding of just like what it means for us to think about doing our work in the future in an equitable way. And so we developed a geography called the priority investment areas. And it was a good, I think, exercise in utilizing GIS and spatial analysis, but then also thinking about like the production and the sharing of that spatial analysis like with the public. So I'll like show some maps later that it was a fun exercise where we got to look at what does it look like if we like shift these features or if we shift the weighting here and looking at these different maps and seeing how they compare. And then also thinking about like, well, how can we talk to people about this in a way that makes sense, that we can explain in like 15 minutes, and that nobody has to read like a full 20-page paper in order to understand. So we started out with, or this is kind of what we ultimately landed, with 3 main inputs. We looked at the percent of non-white population and the low-income population for different, we call them neighborhood tabulation areas, but they're a geography that our Department of City Planning made that sits between census tracts and also between PUMAs, or public use micro areas, because the census tracts can be a little bit unreliable from when you get down to like person level analysis, and then the PUMAs are a little bit too large to like really understand the like intricacies of like different neighborhoods. So we looked at the percentage of non-white low-income population. Then we also looked at job and population density in those same NTAs. And then we did some like calculations to talk about the number of projects we've done in these different areas in the past, and then also the number of like sort of the amount of capital investment that we've put into these zones. And we sort of scored them and then provided some weighting to say, the most weighting went to the non-white and low-income populations, followed by the private investments, and then job and population density, sort of the third lowest weighted. And then we ranked them, and then this tiering system was really done simply to just say, we're going to take the NTAs and we're going to cut them into 3 buckets. So it's like simple. We're not doing anything on this end. It's just like there's 33% in Tier 1, 33% in Tier 2, 33% in Tier 3. And like also important for the messaging here was that it doesn't mean that we're not doing work in all 3 of these tiers. It just means that when we think about starting to prioritize for equity, that we start at the top. So start at Tier 1 zones. And like these are being operationalized in many different ways in the department now. Here are just a couple of our maps that we did as a study as we were going through, really looking at what does it mean for us to like translate some of the variables in like weights. And I think looking at these maps, like it was like part art and part science. Like we did some like statistical analysis to think about like how clustered they were and like how what populations were hit in kind of each one, so understanding like the population breakdown. But also like did some like field tests to say like, okay, we know like certain parts of the city, and we know like the population and like what's happening in that city, and we also know the work that we're doing in that city. And so if a certain like weighting like put a part of the city that we felt was very like shouldn't be in the tier that it was in, like we were like, okay, well maybe that doesn't like quite meet the mark, so let's like look at a few other things. This is the final map of the locations that as they came out, and they're included in our streets plan that was published back in 2021, like the first edition. And these have been going on to be utilized, like I said, in many areas of the department. So like for one, we have a car share program where we like provide shared vehicles for individuals to use on the city streets. And like one way of like we said we're going to prioritize and say like 20% of those zones need to be in the Tier 1 PIAs, like as a way to ensure that the companies weren't just going to places that were already well saturated with this amenity, and ensuring that we're getting exposure to sort of the full set of New Yorkers. And then just like highlighting 2 other things, like a curb management plan is something that has come out of it, and actually we're taking action to do like comprehensive curb management, which is really planning for the streets of New York in terms of the curb, like the pavement. Like a lot of the parking for New York City is just on the street. Like there are parking lots, but they're very expensive, and so like many people like enjoy the like free parking, but we also know that curb space is really important for other things, including loading and unloading, like emergency pickup and drop off, healthcare pickup and drop off. And then we also have some of our like bike and pedestrian like infrastructure that goes into taking away parking too. So the idea is that we should be thinking comprehensively about planning for the curb, just like we think about planning for our transportation system. And then we released an update that showed like how we were doing on these projects. Like, to be honest, like we aren't meeting like many of the marks, but I think that part of the reason is that we are focused on like other work that wasn't necessarily included in the legislation, and like I think focused on like doing the most impactful work and not just putting numbers out just to put numbers out, not to just say we're going to do so many miles of this, but like doing it in the places where it's really needed, so we can improve. And the next update should be coming out soon. I think it was being finalized for the next year, and so we're hopefully going to be able to continue to meet the marks for the legislation, but also to improve on the outcomes that we're important and interested in measuring as well. The second project I want to talk about is the economic benefits of sustainable streets. And so the kind of have the progression here, like back in the Mayor Bloomberg days as well, like there was a push to say, look, we understand like transportation is very related to the land use, but also to a number of other trends and like metrics in terms of like action and like entry into the city. And so we had a report called the Sustainable Street Index, which was really targeted like at looking at our projects and then also looking at things like demographic changes, changes in the number of jobs, changes in the ridership, so some of those outcome things that we put forth. And that really led us to this idea of like, well, we also need to think about, well, what are the changes in the sort of economies around the places in which we're making these projects, because it is a part of our mission as well. Think about the economic vitality of the city. So this report came out, and there are many ways to think about economic vitality, but there are also data constraints. Like when you're out in the world, like working, like it's never really like the perfect data source. And so balancing, I think, trying to be as precise as possible and trying to like utilize the data that we had available. Like we focused on utilizing taxable sales receipts, and then also like businesses that are reporting money and taxable sales for a given period. And that's some proprietary data that we have access to through the Department of Finance. It's held very privately, but it really helped paint a picture to show that our projects. I think the concern is that when we put a bike lane and we remove parking, that like businesses and the places in the area where the bike lane were removed are going to suffer in terms of not having like the people being able to visit those places. And what we were able to show, like with this report, was that there was actually not a correlation between the installation of a bike lane or bus lane or the removing of parking and the vitality of that business. And then the next report, the economic benefits of the Open Streets program, was really focused on the Open Street program was a program that we launched during COVID when we started to find sort of lower volume streets around the city and shut them down to car activity or shut them down to like sort of full access to cars. And so it's like sometimes cars can go in, but they have to travel at 5 miles per hour. It's a much like lower speed because many people still live on these blocks. And it also was a program around the Open Restaurants program. So it's like kind of both of those things were mixed together. The Open Restaurants program was us allowing for restaurants to have outdoor facilities because many people were not eating inside during COVID. And so this was a chance to be out in the open air and for the restaurants to expand their space. And we wanted to look at like, well, using the same methodology as the economic benefits of sustainable streets is like how would this impact the businesses during COVID? And so what we found is that there was sort of clear, we did like measurements on the street, the corridor that was closed. We did a borough average, so like the change in the number of taxable sales companies for the full borough, and then also for a control corridor nearby with similar business numbers and similar characteristics. And in sort of each of the cases, there was either an increase on the open street corridor in terms of the number of businesses that filed, or less of a decrease than on the other corridors. And so I think what we saw this to mean is that there is a positive relationship between the business vitality and the businesses that were able to hang on and operate, and the open streets system. And so this has helped us to gain political support and like community support for continuing to expand the program. All right, so the last project that I'm going to talk about is one in which we are like straight in the middle of a year and a half through. I'll go through the schedule, but it's called Reimagining the Cross Bronx Expressway. And so I wanted to give some context. The last two projects were really citywide projects, but this one is a little bit more neighborhood specific. So this is New York City, the 5 boroughs, Staten Island, Staten Island, Brooklyn, excuse me, Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens. This is Long Island, and this across the center is New Jersey. And so the project in question is in the Cross Bronx Expressway, which cuts, as you see, kind of right through the Bronx and like cuts the like South Bronx from the North Bronx. Created a divide in the community. There's a divide in even I think how people talk about the Bronx because of this roadway. And just like zooming in a little bit more, this is we have a study area that includes the corridor, but also includes the neighborhoods half a mile to the north and south. So corridor studies are a thing that is typically done in the transportation planning world, and it's oftentimes really focused on what's happening like on this corridor. So like how is traffic moving through here? What are the conditions on that corridor? We really took the perspective, and this isn't us, this is like largely a trend that's happening in many places across the country, but to say what happens if we like study this corridor, but from the perspective of the people who live around it. So like what have been the issues that they have in response to this corridor? What are the like concerns that they have about it? And then like how can we think about sort of improving the corridor really through the lens of the communities and not through like the throughput. Like I think acknowledge that this is it's an important like corridor for a number of reasons. It connects New Jersey to much of like upstate New York and much of New England, but I think it has had an undue impact on the surrounding communities, and it's really time for us to think about working with them differently. So like I said, this is a part of a larger trend around the time of the starting of like the Biden administration and of the current Secretary of Transportation, like Pete Buttigieg, that was focused on really like of the cities across the United States that have had highways kind of installed through them, like what has been the impact, and like really saying we want to study and work to improve the impact that these highways have had like on those communities. And so we put forth a grant application to a particular like federal program that was providing funding for studying these initiatives. And this was the sort of the idea that we came up with. This is a picture of the building of the Cross Bronx Expressway. And it really showed just like how kind of close, there were houses here as well. Like this was a very like dense neighborhood. And like to put this, it really did just kind of tear through the neighborhood and has had sort of like really devastating like consequences. And really shows just like, I think the actual physical nature of like how much we modified and like changed the like natural landscape, but two, how much it really hurts to put a like 100 and 150 foot like kind of gaping hole in the middle of a place where people live. And so we submitted this design. The segregation by design is actually a really good project that I recommend like folks look at, which really looks across the country at like older pictures and kind of newer pictures, and shows like really the impact of the highway system and of our like past transportation systems on different communities. We launched with support from our elected officials. We were awarded this grant. I would be remiss if I didn't say, I think a lot of the work to get the money and to get support for this project like started years ago in the community. And we've been working really closely with the advocacy community in the Bronx who has pushed for this project to ensure that their voices are being heard, but also that they are like being able to provide like input and sort of change to the process. We have a 2-year study timeline. So we started out in the summer of last year, really going out to the community and announcing our study and work. Then we went through a pretty like extensive like public engagement front where we were working to ensure that as many issues as we could gather like from the community in as many different ways were collected and cataloged through the issue ID. We are working now on sort of identifying what the potential solutions would be in response to those issues. And then we plan to release a sort of report and sort of next step report later this year. I just wanted to highlight like what we've done as part of like some of the engagement. Like one of the like most impactful, and it was like really nice to hear from all the students I talked to today. Like I think like going to the places and like seeing the places that you're studying is so important. So we've done walks along the highway, we've done bike rides along the highway, we've done navigations along the highway with people who have mobility, disabilities, and really just trying to understand all the different perspectives for the people who live around here and who have to navigate the space here, and like making sure we're capturing like their inputs very well. And then we've also, this is the bike ride event and the supported event where we worked with people who use wheelchairs or who are in other ways like limited in their ability to navigate like certain spaces. And then we've also it's been really impactful for us to be out and go to like community events. So it's like meeting people where they are. It's really important to say, not only do you have to come to like our sessions or our charrettes that we put on, but we're going to come to the events that's already happening, event that is already being organized. There are a number of like annual community events that happen in the Bronx, and like we ensure that we show up there, we have materials, we collect information, and that's like a central part of like our engagement and like planning for this work is ensuring like that a community voice is centered. So I want to just like wrap up by talking about a few things that are coming up to continue to sort of adapt and like change the transportation landscape. You know, I've talked a little bit about this, but I think really central to our work now is understanding like what's happening at the curb and like in cleaning and to manage that. EV adoption, while it does not fix many of our problems in terms of congestion, in terms of like roadway, it does give us a potential benefit to some of the air quality issues that are caused by vehicles. And so I think allowing that to be something that is not only available to people who have like private garages is something that we as a city have been thinking a lot about, like how to allow that to happen and to encourage it. Transit-oriented development, I think, is something we have been pushing for. So we are right now working in conjunction with the Department of City Planning on opening up some new rail stations inside the city and ensuring that the development that happens around those stations is at a high enough density that really supports people living and making like walkable communities around those to support the transit system as we put it together. And then I put this last thing for like new modes and data. We have a like scooter share pilot program that we're operating in the Bronx and like continuing, going to be expanding to Queens. And this really helps us to understand like movement in a different way. I think like part of the continued reliance on many of the measures around vehicle reduction and vehicle change like are based on the fact that we have a lot of data in that area. And like you cannot sort of change what you do not like measure. So we need to understand the travel patterns for people who don't necessarily take cars and need to ensure that we're able to like elevate those experiences and those like work. And so I think having these like new vehicles that allow us to have some anonymized like GPS data makes it like very helpful for us to like make arguments and say this does serve better as a bike route because of the scooters and bikes that are being utilized in that area. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you all very much for listening and hearing about the work, and look forward to your questions and comments afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, any questions?
So when you were talking about the New York City streets plans, you had set out this 5-year comprehensive plan. What kind of things are in place that allow the city to adopt changes in a fairly fast turnaround time? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's something that we're so fortunate to see everywhere as something like I experienced in my planning internship, where even 20 years later, they're not implementing those kind of things. So what kind of things are in place to push that along?
Yeah, so there are definitely some, like, we live in a nation where there's like federal law, and like the things that are controlled at the federal level are controlled, just like the state has the power to control those things. Like, that's our governmental system, and they deed and like give that power to local municipalities. We, I think, have been able to like advocate and to push on the state government to get additional like sort of home rule like responsibility for things, but we still have to do a lot of advocacy and like work at the state level to get many of our things like approved and like pushed forward. One particular program that we continue to like I think like grapple with the state on is, so we have automated enforcement, which is just like the idea that we can use cameras or some sort of automated system to detect when people are violating like the rules of the road, and to issue like tickets to support that. And like the idea is that it's like we can't be everywhere all the time, and that like rules are only as valuable as like their enforcement. And so we need that like that ability to use those systems in like the dense environment. We were talking earlier, and I think I sometimes forget that I am a little spoiled, like in New York. Like, I think because we are this larger city, we're able to, I think, be a little bit more, throw our weight around a little bit more with like the state government. And like, I think we do things like we work directly, like, so for the RAISE grant, like we are direct recipients for the US DOT money. And that's not common. And it's something that I think we like get pushed on, because we say, look, we have our own set of like priorities, and we have our own set of issues that we're dealing with here that isn't necessarily applicable to like the rest of the state. And so we've been able to get that leeway. But I also worked in Chicago and like did not have nearly as much sort of like power things forward independently. Like, we definitely went through the state for like most things. So I understand that it is not it's not common. But yeah, I think we've just been able to like, I think, literally get some of those things enshrined in like state law. And then the other thing I'll say is, I think this sort of temporary, like we call it the street improvement projects, like the idea that we do these like things temporarily has like helped us to somewhat circumvent the longer processes, and just say, look, if it's really bad, like, we're going to take it out. But like we're able to at least like test things out in that way. And we do a number of like pilot programs too.
So you pointed it out that when adding lanes does not relieve congestion because of induced demand. In your experience, as providing alternate routes relieve congestion?
So I'll say one thing. I mean, I think that adding like lanes does immediately oftentimes lead to like reduced congestion, and that's why I think people still continue to push for it. I think the like ultimate solution, and I really meant to like focus on this, is that I think sometimes we as a department get painted as the anti-car, like we're anti-cars, like people shouldn't have cars. And I like the way I say it and try to explain it to people. It's not that people shouldn't have cars. I think there are many trips and many people who need vehicles for a variety of reasons. Like there are many environments, there are many distances that are not like, it's not really logical or like efficient for you to like have to bike like everywhere you like go. I think what I think about a lot is like balance. And so balancing the availability and the like access to like different modes. So I think to answer your question, I would say like, I think alternate routes are like part of the solution. I think like making it easier for people to do trips on transit or by bike is also part of the solution, and that it's not any one thing. The reality is that it needs to be like sort of a multifaceted approach that really like treats our transportation system not just as a thing that's centered around sort of one mode, but a thing that allows choice and like makes all those choices as equal as possible. Like there's still going to be limitations, like people have mobility disabilities and can't always bike everywhere. Some terrain is like very difficult to like travel, and so like there are going to be those places where everything is needed. But I think what we've gotten into is a place where we are very centered around automobiles and in our planning and in our thinking about like solutions for transportation, and that needs to change. Yes.
Some people are concerned, planners and real estate people are concerned about post-pandemic shift from, with huge vacancy rates and shift from office to potentially residential.
Yeah.
What kind of impact are you thinking about that, or talking about it as a department?
Yes. So there is a big proposal from the MTA and the like state level actually to put a congestion surcharge on traveling into Manhattan now. And I think there have been a lot of questions about, well, how does this work for like the return to the office and like for the viability of the office spaces. One thing that we've like seen in the data and the modeling that we like put forth, the traffic levels like back into Manhattan have gotten back to like pre-COVID levels and are sometimes like exceeding them. What hasn't is actually the mass transit and the sort of pedestrian access and like the bike access. And so I think there's definitely a push and pull from the like real estate industry wanting to like ensure those like offices are being utilized in that space. There's like some work I think that the city is doing to think about like making the conversion of office space to residential space like easier. So it's trying to remove some of the barriers for that process. But also I think there's an acknowledgement that it's like Midtown Manhattan is like one of the most accessible transportation, most accessible transit like locations in the world. And so it's like, that's how people should get there. And it's like, there are some people who are gonna have to drive, we like understand that, but I think it's a push to say, we know that transit is available for this, and so we wanna, like we don't think that by sort of limiting or putting the cost on like the travel there, it's gonna like stop people from going. And I think there's been a lot of like review and analysis to like think about who is negatively impacted by this. So like so lower income individuals who couldn't like really absorb that charge and are gonna be like impacted and who need to come to the area. And so there's a whole mitigation package that's like looking at like dealing with like those like communities and also thinking about like what are going to be the impact of like pushing traffic to other areas. I'm kind of like a little bit away from your like question, but I think I connected to this because I think that there is kind of a plateau in terms of how many people are going back into the office, and I think there's going to be work from home for many, many places. And I think the solution is really to figure out like possible like other uses like for those. But I think also there's an underlying belief that's like it's going to continue to come back, and that as like I think that we are going to continue to like move in a direction and we're going to reach a new like steady state that like allows for the businesses to still get the support and to find like use for those buildings and spaces.
We have time for one quick more question, and then we can continue the conversation upstairs in the common studio.
So, with the last project you talked about, what are some of the solutions that you foresee for that problem of division in a neighborhood?
So we're still getting the like details of the solution. There has been a lot of conversation around. Well, I'll talk about precedents, I think, in other places. Two like main conditions like exist around a lot of highways. There's the elevated roadway, which, while connected underneath, like creates these really often kind of liminal and like dead spaces that people operate in. So, and then there's the condition of like the sunken roadway, which literally creates like a hole where you can't like get across. So I think there's a lot of work that's going on. One, trying to like figure ways to like literally fill that gap. So it's like thinking about, are there new like connections that can be made to reconnect like the street grid in like some areas, or are there like things that can go like on top of the highway? We haven't come up with our full like solution pack yet because it's like many things around like air quality very like complicated. It's like it's not, if you put a cap over a certain like section, it may benefit the air quality in that section, but then the air has to come out at some point. And so it's like, well, then you're intensifying it around like other areas. So it's, I think, trying to figure out like what the right set of solutions are. For the like elevated spaces, I think a lot of what we've done in like other parts of the city is like do things to like activate that space. So it's like we have like an Under the L program that creates plazas and like public spaces and like has programming that goes on in these areas. And so they become more lively, they have better lighting, and can be more integrated like into the community and not a space that people avoid or walk through as kind of quickly as possible. And so making them like a little more pedestrian friendly. Oftentimes they have really sort of high clearances, so like trying to figure out a way to like bring things down and really focus on like the people scale. And then, but I think, and I also like to anchor on the fact that there's also a lot of sort of secondary and tertiary effects of the roadway in terms of like sort of conditions, maybe like a few streets off of the expressway, because there's like a lack of connection there. Many people use another route, and creates like unsafe conditions in like these intersections that exist maybe a few spaces away from the highway. So I think we're also thinking about like what can be done to like improve the safety at those intersections, and like what can be done to make like other corridors more friendly and more pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly and multimodal friendly as we're thinking about improving the whole neighborhood.
Thank you so much
yes,
to
thank
all
you.
of you for coming. Don't forget to fill out your Slido. Please join us in the common studio for refreshments and for more questions with Justin, and one more round of applause for Justin.
Thank you.